I'm Peter Underwood. This is News from the Water. This week has seen two lengthy public relations initiatives from Canal and River Trust. The first was something it described as an annual conference, an online presentation chaired by the double act of Alan Leighton as chair of trustees and Richard Parry as chief executive, with recorded guest appearances from a handful of newly appointed C&RT directors. Now, the audience for the 1.5 hour event did hit a high point of 36 at one point. The second, with a slightly bigger audience, was a webinar arranged by the Inland Waterways Association, which gave airtime to another trust double act of London and South East Regional Director Ros Daniels and National Boating Manager Matthew Symonds, who were talking about the future of the region's waterways. Now, having spent 3 hours of my life monitoring both meetings, the first conclusion has to be that any party political spin doctor would be delighted with the way every C&RT participant kept on message. So they all stuck to the agreed script on contentious issues, and potentially hostile questioning, at least in the annual conference, was dealt with by vetting the questions beforehand. Now, the annual conference was largely a rehash by Leighton and Parry of the latest annual report and Richard Parry's most recent video on the same subject. There was, of course, no mention of the way the pair had previously altered figures from an annual report from last year, or of letters that were or were not sent to DEFRA about amended numbers. But this year's dodgy numbers were presented in a claim that the Trust is spending nearly £53 million on major infrastructure works this year, and was made by Richard Parry.
The table here really shows you the trend in our major project expenditure, rising considerably year on year to reach 54 million spent this year. We were able to continue growth during 2021 despite the effects of the pandemic, but further growth this year and looking ahead even more into 22-23. And this is part of this total of around £160 million additional spend that we've planned for the period up to 2027.
And by the new financial director, Steve Dainty.
Despite the restrictions, however, I'm pleased to say that underlying expenditure on major infrastructure works increased to over £50 million.
In reality, our research says that the claimed spend of £52.5 million is totally misleading, as it includes a provision of £36.3 million that's to be spent in future years, and the real infrastructure spend actually paid out this year was less than the £18.5 million spent in C&RT's first year. Heather Clark, C&RT's Strategy, Engagement and Impact Director, gave a pre-recorded summary of C&RT's case to government for getting the grant continued or even extended after 2027.
Waterways are delivering public benefits, but these generation of these important public benefits are fully dependent upon our assets being, firstly, resilient and safe to use and host, and secondly, the waterways must be safe and inviting places for local people to use and enjoy, for businesses and developers to invest, and funders and donors to support. No one fully understood the impact and cost of climate change on the public safety and structural integrity of our waterways, nor the full extent of public benefits being provided by our waterways to the well-being of people, nature and the planet in pre-2012. So that's why it is so imperative that continued government grant support is required post-2027. So we are asking you for your help in our campaign to save the waterways and secure their future by being our advocates in raising awareness of the challenges faced and the value that waterways give to you, your local communities and the nation as a whole, now and in the future.
And when it came to questions in the annual conference, Alan Leighton was reading out those selected by C&RT's in-house team, And although Richard Parry didn't address the National Bargee Travellers Association's claims that new mooring sites on the River Lee were going up when none ever existed, and the trusts were therefore reneging on their promise to put such actions on hold, he did spell out C&RT's determination to go ahead with restricting moorings on the River Lee, and that was reinforced later in the day by Matthew Symonds speaking at that IWA webinar.
But in response to some of the feedback we received on earlier proposals on the water safety zones, we've engaged an independent facilitator. They've been working with all the various stakeholders over the past few months to listen to ideas and sort of understand concerns. And I believe we're currently following the recommendations set out in that report, which includes setting up an independently facilitated Lee navigation forum, and that will continue to review and discuss ideas for improving safety in the area. So we're trying to do what we can. And first of all, we are ensuring, and this is one of the things that came out of the discussion from some of the stakeholder input, to make sure we explained and enforced existing rules before we started talking about a new concept like the water safety zone. So there are some existing no mooring spots, places like bends and bridges where it isn't safe to moor, or where it does constrain the navigation. And it is true that hasn't always been respected by boats, maybe who aren't familiar with the rules. So we have more resources on the towpath, explaining to boaters why these locations aren't suitable for mooring. Trust colleagues, contractors from district enforcement working alongside them to make sure that we communicate, providing additional signage, information. We've published a mooring booklet, and then once we get beyond that, we will want to be looking to try and gently, sort of slowly, to enforce the improper mooring process so that boats don't moor in the wrong places. We are intending to introduce more beyond those where it should already be the case that people shouldn't be mooring in these places, which can have a restrictive effect on other users. So more will be happening in 2022, but we're committed to working through this this process that's been set up following this independent facilitation, which I hope has enabled us and the boaters on the River Lee to come to perhaps a better way of working through these issues together.
Communication campaign that we've been running with boaters is going to continue through to the new year, but from January we will be starting to apply our improper mooring process where boats are moored in no mooring sections. We want boaters to moor safely and considerately, but where they don't, this process will be applied, which ultimately could impact on the ability to hold or renew a boat license. But as I say, what we really want to do is to help people understand where it's not safe to moor, and hopefully moor where it is safe for everybody.
The sale of Waterways heritage buildings has been exercising a number of boaters, but there wasn't much comfort for them, especially those from the National Association of Boat Owners, who've been fighting for an end to the sale of iconic canal heritage buildings. At least 60 have already been sold, and more went up for auction in the last few weeks. But Richard Parry made it clear he saw those buildings as part of the Trust's endowment, only there to bring an income. And if the rent didn't exceed the return on capital the cash from a sale would produce when invested elsewhere, the property would be sold.
And the truth is, although some of the heritage properties may generate some income, very often the net income we make is much less than we would be able to make with an investment elsewhere. And so that's something that our property team, our chief investment officer, will carefully appraise. And we know that there's been very successful transfers of our assets to private owners that have actually meant those assets are very, very well cared for, because they will absolutely take care of the property that they are living in, or that they bought. And so what the Trust is doing is retaining absolutely the core heritage on the network, but where there's a property that we think there may be some wider benefit from selling, we will undertake an independent heritage impact assessment. And if that property should identify that actually its heritage value isn't the very highest category, then we will look at the options for whether a disposal will be in the wider interest. Because very often, as I say, we can generate considerably more income And of course, the bottom line is caring for the waterways is a very costly business, and we have to generate the income to ensure that we can keep the canals open. And so that's the trade-off that we're making. How do we ensure that that endowment is optimized to deliver that income stream? And we are, we would not sell any property that we didn't have very, very, very high confidence was going to be cared for. They will very often have statutory protection that ensures, through the listing system, etc., to ensure that they are safeguarded for the long-term future. And of course, remember that the vast majority of historic properties along the canal network are already in private ownership, never been owned by the trust. So this certainly isn't us, sort of making some big move away from something that was already there. The one thing I should then just add, of course, is that we do.
There was a flurry of interest amongst boaters when Canal and River Trust apparently removed the reference to a 20-mile range from its website, talking about continuous cruises. Richard Parry was apparently unaware of this, but he went on to confirm that his organisation was sticking with that range, although he carefully hedged his assertions by saying it was ultimately up to the courts.
I don't think anything's changed on the website. I mean, we will check, we will ensure that the information is there, but our guidance for boats without a home mooring remains unchanged, to confirm. It's been in place for at least a decade or so now, I think. Reflects our understanding, our interpretation of the requirements for continuous cruiser movement under the legislation, and that hasn't changed. We have, I know, tried to provide further illustrative guidance wording on our website, series of Q&A examples, that sort of thing, but that's really just to help expand on, so it doesn't replace and doesn't have the same status as our formal guidance. And I should clarify, we cite a cruising range of sort of 20 miles by way of illustration, provisional indication, if you like, of whether a boat's movement would satisfy us as the navigation authority that it's used bona fide for navigation. Ultimately, it's for the courts to decide in each case, because it does depend upon the pattern of movement. And whilst a range of 20 miles may not be enough in every case, depending on the pattern of movement, what we can, so we've never said what it is, not to be awkward about it, but in truth, it's for the law for the courts to determine that in each case. But what we can say, with I think a fairly high degree of certainty, is that anyone who covers a range of less than 20 miles, so that's a full sort of 20-mile range in a year, is very unlikely to be satisfying their licence requirements, and hence are likely to be subject to enforcement action. And so that's why we actively engage with boaters, to remind them of the requirements, to assist, encourage them to move. And of course, we try to prioritise those moving least. Very often they may need some support, because unfortunately too many boaters don't move as much as 20 miles. And we want, of course, to encourage boaters to comply with their terms and conditions. We do prioritise our resources. We will respond, of course, to changing circumstances, and be, as I say, as helpful as we can, before we have to, of course, insist that everyone does follow the same basic framework of legislation, rules, guidance, so that everyone has the same fair opportunity to use the waterways. But of course, we do try and work.
And finally, the London Boaters webinar provided some insights into the battles to come in London and the South East. It still already seems clear that London boaters organised by the NBTA are on a collision course with C&RT over the mooring spaces removed from the River Lee on the excuse that boats had been banned from tying there in the past. And that will come to a head in the new year, as C&RT tries to enforce those newly signed no mooring areas. But there may be more to come, and Matthew Symonds, National Boating Manager, spelled out some of the options C&RT may be taking as it continues its campaign to control liveaboard boats in the capital.
Identifying what options we can do. So there are some things that we are going to be consulting on, hopefully starting next month. I'm very confident that we will start that consultation in December, but they're focused on areas that are more specific proposals around further pre-booked moorings on some short stay sites, and that could include some seasonal pre-booked mooring as well. We've listened to the views about how we could manage short stay mooring better. So we'll be looking and consulting on options of ways we could manage that more effectively, and hopefully people seeing us managing those spaces. And we're also considering the overstay charges. So as I say, we can't issue fines, but we can and do issue overstay charges for exceeding short stay mooring times. But we're going to consult around the level of that overstay charge and get a view on that before we make a proposal on that. And then clearly we're looking at banning any double moorings of wide beam boats on some waterways, just to make sure that it maintains a safe navigation. So we'll be asking for views on those things. So there are going to be some specific proposals that we'll consult on from next month through to the spring. So there'll be plenty of time for people to give their views. But we also want to ask some views about some in principle things. So not specific proposals we have, but some questions we want to ask about whether we should be looking at creating more permanent moorings in certain areas further away, further out from the busy parts of London. Now, at the moment, our policy is not really to support online mooring, permanent online mooring. So we haven't been doing any of that really in London. But obviously there are constraints on where you can create offline mooring. There's, although there are lots of big water spaces adjacent to our waterways, old quarries that have been filled in, when we looked at whether we could access those to create mooring spaces as part of the mooring strategy, the cost and logistics were insurmountable, unfortunately. So if there is a demand, which we know there was from the work we did developing the mooring strategy for more permanent mooring, we want to ask people's views on the principle of creating some more permanent moorings in those quieter parts further out. But as I say, it isn't specific proposals, it's really a sounding on what people's views are. And also we'll be asking people's views on the principle of how we fund better boating facilities, because the cost is high, the demand is great, and to make sure that is sustainable, it's not just about putting them in, but maintaining them to a standard that people expect. So we'll be asking some in principle views on that. So as I say, those are the headlines. I can't share the specifics, but you won't have to wait long. We're looking to start that consultation in December.
Well, that's it from me. See you soon.